interesting conclusions. We also take them to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. And of course, that's a highly biased in some ways presentation. It's an excellent museum, but it's very biased presentation. And after we see that, then the kids come home and they do this kind of direct reading of primary sources, even call it a primary source, and come to their own conclusions, which I really think is a way around some of the complexities. You know, as historians and adults, we can talk about some of these approaches, but it's not very accessible to younger children, high school children, or even younger than that. So I'm just as a technique in the classroom, we lose that sort of big context, but we gain something else, which I think in terms of understanding how do you approach historical evaluation when we're just talking about an event that has nothing to do with their immediate lives. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's very useful. I just want to add that I'd like to try to, when I do that, to try to get sources from all sides. That is, like, you know, right now there's a big article in the Journal of American History. This is like the anniversary, obviously, of the War of 1812. And so it was looking at the war from the perspective of the United States, Canada, Great Britain, and seeing that the war is viewed very, very differently in all those places. So that if you can use sources, I think, and by the way, there even our books are collections of textbooks treatments of the same events from multiple perspectives from different nations. I think that's really helpful as well. Because I just think in terms of international conflict, it's just fundamentally distorting to look at things just from the perspective of the U.S. Like I was thinking, my son was doing a class around Vietnam, and he read the accounts of the U.S. attack, the conflict, the attack on the U.S. boats in the Tonkin Gulf, and beginning the war in Vietnam, or the beginning of that phase of the war in Vietnam. And it turned out, you know, in retrospect, now that things have been declassified, the big headlines, all the big stories were basically based on lies about the so-called second attack. The only story that actually had an accurate version of it, which is, you know, kind of amazing in retrospect, given I grew up during the Cold War, was this little squib on the inside from Beijing, that was saying that there wasn't a second attack and it wasn't, you know, it had been made up. You know, in other words, so I think getting that international perspective is really important because you never know who's telling the truth and who's sort of distorting things.
Ruth, I know you already asked a question. Are there others? Okay, go ahead.
Something that we use, be it individual teaching, was to come in and give them the key to understanding what the universal reality was in all of this. And that's telling them about petroleum and the importance of oil to every country. And really stressing it and making them understand, you know, could that be something that motivates people? Wouldn't that help to explain why Saudi Arabia was such a good friend of ours? You know, where does our money go to, et cetera, et cetera. When we do that, when we let them examine the economics of petroleum, that we can't live without it and we haven't come up with enough alternatives. Therefore, if you were running the country, what would you have done back at those times? You know, we have some alternatives to it now, but you know, what would you have done? And that gives them a very big question to solve, and puts a nice sheen on us also that they've got to keep their people running also in our economy. So that was a proper thing, but it has to be introduced early.
I think that's a very important issue. That is, what is it that influences American or shapes American foreign policy? That, in other words, like, is it all about economics? You know, I mean, I think in the Middle East, that's obviously a very live issue. You know, I always, just to complicate things, I think, well, what about the U.S. invasion of Grenada? Did we need nutmeg? You know, it's not the same answer for every conflict, but I think trying to figure out what is it that drives American foreign policy is really important. And that comes back to the issue about, you know, where does the democratic public discourse connect or disconnect from the economic motivations? In other words, democracy and capitalism are sometimes in conflict. And so So being able to understand that gets at the whole issue of, you would call it informal empire or whatever. I think it's really important to be able to sort of teach critical thinking skills about what pushes America to play this role that it's playing. What is the factor that's leading, or what range of factors lead the U.S. to intervene? Why it does that? I think is really, really important. I have this book by Stephen Kinzer called it's about interventions, looking at the whole course of from Hawaii and the Spanish, Cuban, American stuff all the way to the present, and he looks at them, in comparative terms. I think it's very useful to think about, these different case studies of intervention. So in other words, you're not just narrating an event, but you're trying to think about the big picture. That is, what is the driving force, or is there a driving force in shaping American foreign policy?
I also think it's really challenging to have that conversation, or to start that conversation when, at political debates, I'm thinking about the Republican primaries, Rick Santorum was explaining why the United States was attacked because the terrorists hate Western ideals, and then Ron Paul countered with, well, no, we have bases in Saudi Arabia, and unfair treatment of Palestine and stuff along those lines, and he got booed tremendously. And he's like, look, I'm not justifying, these aren't my words, I'm just telling you what they've said. So, that's my comment.
I think that's a good point.
On the topic of oil, you suggest that teachers need to get behind the 9/11 story and to global context and what does it mean and why is the United States in the Middle East and the 60-year struggle, And I think oil is one of the things that's really hard to unpack and to understand. And it's not just sort of greedy capitalist, it's sort of survival of the industrial world, when that much of the world's petroleum is buried under that part of the world. But the other part, I think for Americans and American teachers, it's really hard to unpack, is our commitment to Israel. That's a really hard thing to teach in any kind of critical fashion. Even to acknowledge that people around the world see our commitment to Israel as excessive, questionable, that's almost off limits.
Yeah.
So we founder on oil and Israel in trying to put this in world context.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. Israel especially is something which can't be talked about in this country. It's not the case in Europe.
No, certainly
or the
not.
rest of the world in any sort of rational way. Again, whatever position one has, it should be possible to look at this in a complicated way and trace the relationship and try to make sense of it. But it's largely off limits in public discourse. I would hope that there would be ways that in public schools, in schools generally, where these things should be talked about, one could do it. The materials are out there, right? They're now accessible materials that present a range of views. The ways one can talk about this in Israel are much broader than one can talk about in this
that's
country,
what
right?
I
If you read the Israeli
understand
press,
that.
right, which is available on the web in English or chunks of it, people argue quite bitterly about the history and
That's good
They-
catnip.
yeah, so that
Exactly.
you can find lots of things by
Israeli
Israelis.
new historian.
Yeah, some of the best interesting work on this revisionist work has been done by Israeli scholars. So now they can also be classified as self-hating, etc. But what we have to challenge these and use the materials that are out there to treat this as we would anything else, and not have taboos where we can't ask certain questions and look at certain things. Again, not easy, and there are pressures about this, right? We in universities get trashed a lot about this and get attacked, and there are organized campaigns by groups which don't want certain things to be said. When if it was about China or about Bolivia or about Poland, it'd be okay to say these things or to raise these questions at least and have these discussions. It's not okay. So I don't envy you. I certainly understand. The oil, it seems to me, is sort of different because it's not, Exxon is not mounting campaigns if you try to talk about the importance of oil quite to try to deny people tenure or whatever, right? And there is a pretty rich literature, but it is because it's an economic issue and it's very abstract and distant, I think, for most people. I mean, I've always wondered if it'd be possible. I know my kids did a lot of these thematic studies in elementary school, and then they sort of stopped, for them at least. But there's a very direct connection between what goes on with the gasoline and tracing that network sort of. I don't know how this could be done creatively, but looking at what happens from our local gas pump, back to Saudi Arabia, and some of the things that go into that, and how then that's about power politics, it's about economics, it's about many different things, and history of course is very much in there. There's a lot of history to that. How one makes that concrete and teachable as a curriculum, I don't know, but it certainly should be there as a way of saying again, like any other country, the United States or people who make these decisions have a certain vision of America's interests. And again, there's argument about that. There have been very sharp divisions about that throughout American history. But one of the key thrusts of that, certainly in the 20th century, has been about control of oil. Right? Even though the United States does not depend critically on Middle Eastern oil, that's seen as a strategic resource of great significance, which the United States has to have a central role in, or at least policymakers have since the end of the Second World War seen as a key priority for the United States at almost whatever cost. And out of that you get the alliance with Saudi Arabia, out of that you get the tens of billions of dollars spent every year on American fleets and bases in the Mediterranean and in the Gulf, and all sorts of other things. And from that you get to bin Laden, right, among other things, right, as one way of responding to that.
I guess there are also religious reasons now amongst conservative Christians who support Israel unconditionally on the grounds of it being an important part of the Second Coming.
There's that, although I think, here in New York, I'm not sure that's quite as hot an issue as
No, not here.
in some places,
No,
but we're
but out there in America.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're about to have this advertising campaign, right, in our subways, right, that some crazy has decided to launch about, if you have a choice between the savage and the civilized man, you should side with the civilized man, support Israel. So that takes us back to the kinds of things that were in a very crude way in that video.
They're going to be in the subway stations now, are they?
On subway cars, so I understand. But it taps into some very deep roots. Even in American society, where contact with Islam was minimal, as opposed to Europe, which has a long history of interaction with the Muslim world. So it taps into that. Of course, it taps into the energies unleashed by September 11th. And it taps into the fact that the for most Americans, unlike Judaism, right, Muslims are still very alien, right? Even with the growing number of Muslims who are part of American society, that number will only grow in the decades ahead, and Muslims will become a more significant force in the United States. At this point, it's still deeply, deeply alien, and one can say things about Muslims that one could never get away with saying about Jews. The kind of things that were said about Jews, actually, were still okay to say 50 years ago, and that a century ago were okay to say about Catholics. You get the same thing about Muslims, except that the United States there were not people in the United States 50 years ago who thought they were at war with the Jews, quite right, in the way that for a lot of people it's this clash of civilizations idea, this fundamental conflict between something utterly different and alien and us, and we know what each of those is, we know who they are, we know who we are, is very much part of the way they frame the world. So that's another huge challenge to...
I guess your task as educators is to complicate and deconstruct these headlines, these blocks of thought and ideas. It's a tough call, it really is. I remember the slogan of the first Director General of the BBC back in the 1920s was that the task of the BBC was to inform, educate and entertain, with a very low priority on entertain where the BBC was concerned. But there was a very, very strong sense of that didactic, pedagogic job that the BBC should be involved in. Long vanished, but it was there at its inception.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that one way to try to get at this is to give, again, go primary source of multiple perspectives. But also, I think, it's difficult. I'm not just on Israel. Like, for example, when I was teaching about race, I taught at University of Georgia for almost a decade. And when I taught about desegregation of the South, or talked about, I was trying to look at it in the context of college campuses. And I thought the way to avoid this, antagonizing people was to talk about discrimination a documentary on discrimination in the fraternities and sorority houses at Berkeley.
Right.
You know, so it was not in Georgia, right? Which I thought was really effective. Then I got my teaching evaluation of the year. Why does Cohen have to spend a month talking about the conflict between fraternity, the races, and be picking on fraternities and sororities at Georgia? You know, when it was actually one session. So I think, you know, there's a way in which, you know, you have a political context that you're well aware of, that you're not going to eliminate. But I think there's strategies for trying to deal with it that involve, I think, multiple perspectives and just trying to, as you're saying, open people up to other ways of looking at it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think, by the way, it's our role, and I'm sure you all feel the same way, to proselytize for one perspective.
Yeah.
And even if you do believe in a perspective, that students who have a different perspective are going to, I don't think they usually, the light goes on and they change their mind immediately anyway.
Yeah.
So I think that just trying to show them a different way of looking at, say, the Arab-Israeli conflict than they had grown up with is, you know, it's part of, I think, our responsibility.
Yeah.
And that's just, if you do it in a kind of a careful way, and I'm sure Zach can say more about this because he teaches a course about this at the college level, I think that you can do that. You know, it doesn't mean you're not going to have some friction or tension. That's natural when you're exposing people to things they're not comfortable with. But I think that's also just prefaced by, look, our job in teaching history is to try to look at the world that you're in, and not from just one perspective. I mean, again, that sounds utopian or something. I know, just from my own experience, it doesn't always work out that way. People get angry when they're and the views they grew up with are really challenged. But I think it's something that you can do.
Jeff, did you have your hand up?
No.
No, okay, go ahead.
Thank you.
Brandon,
So-
Tom.
Just picking up on what you just said, we don't want to say proselytizing for one perspective. In a way, though, what everyone that you have said is you're proselytizing for this very open, broad perspective. And I mean, I'm in complete agreement with it, but I found myself at times making that clear, that we are choosing to take a broader approach here, that our commitment to looking at multiple sources, our commitment to entertaining diverse ideas is actually a bias, and to really make that clear and obvious and transparent. And I was wondering what you sort of think about that aspect of it.
I don't think it's I mean, I agree with you in a certain sense, but I don't think it's a bias to say that, you know, we're going to try to do what historians do, which is try to follow the evidence no matter where they lead you. That's different than sort of like a traditional sort of civics approach, which is, you know, from the early 20th century, which is we want to Americanize people and get them to accept the way things are and accept American virtue and all that. I don't think I think explaining your approach is important. I don't even say I'm unbiased. Obviously, we all have biases, but I think it's different than saying, look, if you want to get A in this course, you've got to be a critic of the Vietnam War. You know, I've seen this actually happen. You know, people think that the way that they they'll do well in a course is by agreeing with the teacher, and I think encouraging students to disagree and welcoming disagreement, you know, so that you're actually being consistent with what you're saying, that you don't really feel like you have some political line. So I agree with you, though, that making it very clear that this approach is very different than an approach that's just, going to have just sort of like one perspective. I mean, I agree, but I wouldn't call that a bias. I think that's more like, that's what historians do. That is, good history is about trying to, to make sense of the event in as accurate a way as you possibly can by dealing with sources that you may not be comfortable with or familiar with initially. So I agree with you, but I wouldn't kind of frame it precisely the way that you have, though.
So much of this conversation reduces to what you, Professor Cohen, set up as a dichotomy, though I realize that you probably didn't mean to, between this socialization of students to the American way and critical thinking skills. Would that socialization meant critical thinking skills, right? We'd all be better off. I think in our classrooms, perhaps that's the goal, to make students realize that the diversity they recognize in the United States, that is the very fabric that is really our only true mark of identity, ought to really inhere in everything else that they do. But then once they leave our classrooms, they're inundated with exactly the opposite. And there's so little critical thinking. We value it so little as a society. And their technological world is one that actually diminishes their ability. I mean, the images coming at them so rapidly their whole form of communication. So we're dealing with larger issues of technology. There are different ways of learning today. So the whole project of critical thinking and building those skills is just so difficult on so many different levels.
Yeah, I guess I want to say that I agree with everything you said, except I would put it this way. I also think there's a sort of classic article by James Lemon called The Two Cultures of Social Studies Education. That I think that the dominant mindset among teachers and education professors and all that is exactly what you're describing.
Yeah.
But I think there's also a perspective that's different than that, which is like that social studies is about promoting a kind of loyalty to the country, stressing what's our common heritage, what's good about America. There is a part, like, think about, I really appreciate it, but years ago Bob Byrd created this Teaching American History Grant Project, which unfortunately has been defunded because of the Tea Party and all that. It was the largest professional development federal program funded by the federal government, really the only one in American history. And it's ending this year. I've had 3 of these grants, and the original idea was he wanted people to understand the Constitution and take pride in the country and all that. And actually, when you did that grant project, you couldn't do anything overseas. It was all about, had to be at the water's edge. It was about America in this sort of traditional. Now, of course, we got the money, and we sort of, given how we're teachers and historians are, nobody sees the world quite that narrow a way as educators. But I'm saying, I think there is an expectation there among part of America, particularly the right, that the schools will play that role. So I agree with you, but I also think there is a tension and a conflict about what the schools ought to be doing about these issues. And so I think there will be people who would be very upset about, sort of on the right, about this whole conversation or the way that you framed it. So I think there is, and also, you're in New York, so it's a bit different here than, say, when I taught in Georgia, and the fear, the sort of the pressures people are under, and the issues about academic freedom. So I agree that's, from my perspective, what you described is what we ought to be doing, but I do think there is, it's more in the nature of I think a kind of a debate to some degree about what's the purpose of social studies and whether we really want to open up this whole can of worms that we're talking about, or maybe we should wait till people get to college to deal with these issues, which I think is really, very bad preparation for college, for citizenship, for life. You put off critical thinking till you're.
Yeah, that's a bit. I just had a recollection that the monolithic kind of vision of things that we sometimes have, I had a shocking and actually exhilarating revelation that this is not always true. When I made a film in the month after 9/11 based around this extraordinary explosion of photographs taken on 9/11, which were exhibited in a little storefront down here under the title "Here is New York." Thousands and thousands of pictures. And we did a film in which we chose a number of the pictures and took them out and went across America trying to meet up with the people who bought them to talk about why they had and what their motivations were. And one of the places we finished up, it was a school in Montana, in southwest Montana, pretty little town miles from anywhere, and talking to the kids there who were, I suppose, 12, 13, 14 years old, about 9/11. What startled me was that they all had immensely complex and layered views about why that had happened. Where the heck they got this from, I have no idea, but not one of them had a monolithic notion that it was bad guys who came from far away and zapped us. All of them wanted to talk about what made this happen, what were the determinants, what was the background, what had we done to provoke this. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. Either there were a couple of very good teachers in that school, I suppose it's a liberal enclave of Montana where I happen to find myself, I just don't know. Not what I expected.
I think that one of the things somebody else mentioned right after how much conversation there was in New York, what happened. I think that in the first months and year, things were a lot more fluid.
Yeah.
Mayors and presidents were going to mosques, and Muslims were demonstrating in New York. about, support for victims, and there was a lot of talk about, but as time goes on, things congeal.
Yeah.
And the story congeals. I've looked at war memorials in Hiroshima and in Nanjing, the Japanese and the Chinese remembering, great World War II atrocities. And I wonder if our 9/11 memorial is going to be like those, monuments to evil that was done to us, and sort of rallying points for national feeling, and kind of impervious to multi-layered understandings of things.
That seems likely, unfortunately.
And I was
Have
also
you seen the memorial? What could you use that in teaching?
Well, it's not, the museum's not open yet. I've been to the
Just
memorial.
the memorial.
But the memorial is there for the victims, right? So it
Yeah.
has the names of the victims. Of course, there was controversy about who gets listed and what order. There are interesting questions about that as well, of course, but that's peripheral. But it's the museum which, as I understand it, will have the context, will offer the history, will offer the larger analysis. And at least from, again, what we've seen on the 9/11 Memorial website, it doesn't bode very well to try to provide with the kind of context which I, as a historian, would like to see, and which I think people need to understand, without, of course, detracting from the tragedy and the paying homage to those who died and the firefighters and the police and all the rest. That needs to happen. And that's, it seems to me, reflective of more generally, with, of course, some exceptions, how this has been dealt with, except for Ron Paul, maybe.
Well, also with public history, I want to say it's very complicated. Like, I think that my impression from the article was the museum staff wanted to take the story all the way back to the 1970s in Afghanistan and wanted to do these accounts of these of the terrorists, and that they were getting political heat for doing it. And then they said, well, we'll only talk about the evidence proving that they were guilty. It reminds me too of the big controversy over the Enola Gay,
Yes.
and the issue about showing this from any kind of a Japanese perspective, and then the Air Force veterans groups chiming in, and then basically abandoning the whole script. So I think it should be easier, theoretically, for us as historians or history teachers in our classrooms to discuss this than it is in a memorial. And that's where I think commemoration and historical analysis are difficult to fit together. Because, I think there's also this, obviously, this emotional thing. I think that it reminds me really of when I was a teenager and the war of Vietnam was waging. Couldn't really have a rational discussion in my family between the sort of World War II and Korean veterans who were my uncle and my brother and the younger generation, because people were dying. And so there's a kind of an emotional element to that makes it really difficult in that context. Whereas I think a classroom, you have, like, you're a step removed from that. You should be at least able to, not have to deal with that static. I wouldn't expect a war memorial. It'd be nice if they did it, but I wouldn't really expect a war memorial to be able to do what a filmmaker could do or what a teacher can do in a classroom, what a historian can do in a book.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, just, under that banner of, I can tell you all about your problems, but I can't figure out my own. It's just, too close to home. And maybe, with the example of looking at other memorials outside, I was struck by, we were in Ankara this past March, and at the Ataturk Museum, which is, it was the war museum, and it was this painting of these Greek soldiers massacring young kids and raping a woman on the cover with the priest with the cross in the middle, and it was very clear the sort of propaganda that what it was, because I was an outsider, and there's little Turkish kids coming through the museum, 3 years old, looking at these paintings, and I was had that sort of eureka moment of it's too close to home in the U.S., even for us at times maybe, but maybe that's an entree into these discussions, is to look at something else from the outside and say how, or are we in some ways perpetuating some narrative nationalism or some sort of authoritarian story.
There is, by the way, a good literature about this. Danny Walkowitz, who teaches here, edited a book about these public places, and it was my favorite one was about the Alamo. The Alamo, and actually there's a great scene from the John Sayles movie. You ever seen Lone Star? Where it has the Anglos and the Chicanos arguing about who was the good guy, who was the bad, who was the enemy, and sort of looking at the the way that the Alamo is depicted, and not dealing with the issue of slavery in Mexico and what the Texans are really fighting for, and the sort of the different competing interpretations. I mean, so maybe a way around this might be to,